You made it to part 2 of the course, module 5. And in part 2 of the course, we're dealing with issues that are related to the first part of the definition of capitalism that I gave at the beginning of the course. Capitalism is a social system that's based on private ownership and voluntary exchange, and all the issues that we'll confront in part 2 of the course, all the modules that we'll be taking up, will be related to ownership claims or problems that arise in the context of ownership claims. And the first one is the problem of environmental harm. We've seen this before in the documentary. The documentary argued that corporations are externality generating machines. Environmental harms are externalities. And so it's no surprise that a corporation, when it could get away with it, would be very happy to externalize the cost of its doing business on the rest of us, on the rest of society. They would do this in pursuit of profit. We also saw this in Roderick Long's essay on conflationism. I'm just going to read the 2-sentence part that's relevant. He said, it's a slightly different diagnosis of the problem. He said, government favoritism also underwrites environmental irresponsibility on the part of big business. Polluters often enjoy protection against lawsuits, for example, despite the pollution status as a violation of private property rights. So when a corporation generates smog or whatever in the course of its doing business, the smog sort of floats along in the common air that everyone has to breathe. It doesn't stay within the confines of the corporation's property. It has a negative effect on me, a non-consenting third party, and there's nothing I can do about it, right? The fact that they're able to shift these costs onto me, right? Normally, a business would have to internalize and pay for all of the costs that it generates. But if it's able to shift some of the costs onto me, it avoids those costs. And that functions as a kind of subsidy for the corporation. And of course, economists know that when you subsidize something, you tend to get more of it. So notice what I've done. I've understood pollution as a kind of environmental harm, pollution as a kind of negative externality, and pollution applying to a kind of a common pool resource, air that everyone has to use. So let's take a closer look at this. I say environmental harm is a negative externality. It's an externality that's negative. Of course, there are positive externalities, but pollution isn't one of those. It's something that affects non-consenting third parties. That's actually making them worse off. Right? Pollution or negative externalities, environmental harm, it allows perpetrators to concentrate benefits on themselves while dispersing costs on non-consenting third parties, that is, us. In other words, it allows perpetrators to privatize the benefits of their doing business, associated with their doing business, and socialize the costs of their doing business. Right? And the big question about this is why are they able to get away with it? What's the appropriate way to deal with it? To answer this question, I think we need to get a better handle on exactly what the nature of the problem is. And so I suggested earlier that we should treat pollution as applying to certain kinds of common pool resources. And that's helpful because there's a kind of, there's a logic that's associated with the use of resources that are characterized as common pool resources. So in a commons, the defining characteristic of a common pool resource is that you have multiple people, each of whom have ownership rights. That means nobody gets to exclude another person from using the resource. Multiple owners, so to speak, are each endowed with the privilege to use whatever resource we're talking about, and no one has the right to exclude any others. When you get too many owners who have these privileges of use, sometimes there's a tendency for this resource to become overused. And this is when you have what's called a tragedy of the commons. Depleted fisheries because of overfishing, that's an example of a tragedy of a commons. Overgrazed pastures are another kind of canonical example of this all too familiar tragedy. So let's use that example to run through to show how the logic of a commons is supposed to work in the model. So we're going to assume we have a pasture that is owned as a common pool, but you have 10 shepherds who live around the pasture, each of whom have private ownership over each of their 10 sheep. Right? So we have 10 shepherds, 10 sheep each. That makes 100 sheep. And at this point, let's just make some assumptions. We say that each animal is worth $1 to its owner, so that at the carrying capacity of the pasture, 100 sheep are worth $100, right? Also, again, although the 10 shepherds treat their individual flocks as private property, they jointly treat the land as one big pasture. There are no internal fences to the pasture, and so all the animals graze freely. None of the shepherds have a right to exclude any of the other shepherds from using the pasture. Now, at this point, let's suppose that one shepherd adds an additional sheep, an 11th sheep. Right? So now there's 101 sheep altogether. And again, according to the assumption that we've made, we've exceeded the land's carrying capacity. There isn't quite enough food or grass per sheep anymore. And so let's say that because of that, each of them can't eat as much as they used to. And so each of the 101 sheep are a little bit leaner. And so let's say that affects their value. That means that the value per sheep drops to 95 cents each. Right? So now the total stock of 101 sheep is worth $95.95. That's a loss, right? From the point when the herd was kept within the land's carrying capacity. Right? So the question is, why would they do that? Why would this shepherd add this 11th sheep to his individual flock when he would know that this is going to represent a total loss of $4.05? That's a losing proposition. Right? Well, the answer, of course, is that from the individual shepherd's point of view, he's come out ahead. He has 11 sheep, each worth 95 cents. His total value before was $10. It's now increased by 45 cents. So he's made a profit of 45 cents by adding the extra animal, even though the value of the total herd was reduced by $4.05. So look what he's done. He's been able to concentrate a benefit of 45 cents on himself, but spread out a loss of $4.05 on the rest of the 9 shepherds, right? Although the total cost to the group of adding the extra sheep exceeded the total benefit, the individual shepherd received 100% of that benefit, and he only paid 10% of the cost. The remaining 90% of the cost is paid by the other 9 shepherds. That's 10% each. But individual shepherds only see individual costs and benefits. And so from his point of view, he's won, right? Benefits were concentrated on one shepherd, costs dispersed among the group. And so we have a commons tragedy. Right? A commons tragedy occurs if and when individually rational use of a common pool resource culminates in a pattern of collective overuse that exceeds the resource's capacity for self-renewal. Right? What can they do about this, right? You can see that the logic of it, if you're rational and self-interested, you're going to be pushed to add this additional sheep. But of course, if you reason this way, then all the other shepherds will see the point and also reason this way. And if nobody can prevent anybody else from using the pasture, from adding additional sheep, then they're just going to keep doing it and keep doing it until the land is completely useless. It's barren and dry. There's no grass for any sheep. There's a commons tragedy, right? So Hardin's point when he presents an example like this is that, look, you could say, well, they should just be moral. They should just rely on people's consciences to keep them within the bounds of the carrying capacity of the land. But of course, that's not going to work because you restrain yourself. But that just makes it more profitable for the other shepherds to not restrain themselves. Again, it's rational for each individual member to keep adding sheep until, once again, we've hit the point of tragedy. So another way to think about it is just to use this language of concentrated benefits and dispersed costs. That's the logic motivating the decline into a tragedy. So these are the lessons that Hardin wants us to draw from this kind of logic. The first is that commonly held resources will be overexploited. These resources that are commonly held include natural resources like clean air and water. It could include things like a sustainable ecosystem. It could include things like a healthy diversity in plant and animal life. All sorts of things. These tragedies can't be remedied by appealing to the goodwill or the consciences of those who are in a position to exploit the resource, because if nothing else, people will act in the rational way, the individually rational way, merely in order to avoid being a kind of chump, right? Why should he alone restrain himself when this just makes it easier for the other folks to take advantage of him? Right? The point is here that the costs of upholding environmental ideals have to be borne by the people who are there on the ground, right? So that just means like the Nike, I'll call it the Nike morality. Just do it. Just be good. Just restrain yourself. That's not really going to work. Rather, all solutions, according to Hardin, involve restricting access to the resource. And so any viable solution, I should say, will involve restricting access to the common pool resource to prevent its overuse, to prevent its overexploitation. So the rest of the lecture, I'm going to run through proposed solutions, and they break down into three categories, right? There are three types of solutions that people propose. The first is a kind of model of top-down legislation. The second is a system of privatization. You take the resource out of the common pool by privatizing it, giving it to individuals who now have the legal power to prevent or exclude another person from using it. That's the way to prevent the resources overuse. And then we're going to talk about some hybrid solutions. And I think the hybrid solutions are probably the ones that Elinor Ostrom most prefers. So I'm going to stop here. I'm going to break this up, and then I'll start with the legislative model in the next video.